So that was my amazing first slide.
Ouch!
There we are. How do we test a Python function that is dependent on Docker? And then I was just sharing with you here, this is our GitHub page for PyGyver from made.com. It's an open source project. Basically, it's a bunch of wrappers to help us to do ETL, to help us to load stuff and into database, into our data warehouse for our analysts, data analysts to do their job. And you can install it off PyPy. So this is the kind of thing, I don't really want to look at this too long, but this is the kind of thing that PyGyver does. Here you've got a YAML file that specifies that we're going to create a table. Here's a table ID and a dataset ID and a schema. And it's a bunch of things that basically, this is going to get eaten by some functions and create some tables. And so we've got lots of functions. There's an example function. I said we have create table functions. Well, here we've got a load from DB function. So this is what I was trying to write. Load data from another DB into BigQuery. And I can specify basically the target. And then also I'm going to specify what the source is. So I want to go really to how I tested it. So in order to test this function, what I needed was a DB to test against. And I couldn't really use a production DB. So I had to spin up a Dockerized DB. And I suppose one way to do it is to specify in your Docker Compose. So if you're not familiar, Docker Compose specifies attributes for a container, a Docker container that's going to get built. And here we've got different services. This one's the one we wanted for testing. And I've added this depends on clause. And what that means is it's also going to spin up this container here, which is a container with a Postgres image. And it's also going to spin up the MySQL database over here. So when I'm running these tests, I'm spinning up multiple containers just to do the tests in, just to do the tests against. And then my test function just creates, basically I have to connect to the database. This is using SQL Alchemy. And then I'm running a test. I'm like seeing if my function works and so on. But then I found out about test containers with 28 seconds left. And test containers basically is a lovely, simple method for doing that whole process really quickly. So this is what the code got turned into. Instead of spinning up, connecting to a database in the Docker Compose, spinning up the database, you literally don't have to do that. You can just specify the container here. So I've just specified with the DB container as test DB. And then I'm just going to create a connection and then I can do my test against it. And that's literally all I need. I just need this line here to say what the DB container is. In this case, it's Postgres container. That's a MySQL container. So that's marvelous. So you'd have thought that's what I went with, but the moral of the story is I didn't end up going with that. I went with the first option. I did it in the Docker Compose. And that's because when you're working, there's always a trade-off between the business and doing things in the most technical way. And unfortunately, there's a bit of an issue with test containers, which is that you need to give your container code, the tests that run in your container, you need to give it the access to spin up another container. And that means forwarding the Docker socket, the Docker daemon into the container. And the guys at Ops, they weren't very happy about it. So they said to me, that could be a security risk. So imagine you've got the container's been spun up to run your test, and that test is talking to another container that has your DB in. And as I said, you can either spin up that DB container manually, or alternatively, test containers will just do it for you. But the problem is, test containers needs access to Docker to be able to do that. Normally, if you did it in the first place, then Docker Compose could just do it. But because your test container, the test itself needs to spin the thing up, you need to give it access. And the problem I faced was when I explained this to my ops, sysops, DevOps at work, they basically said, hang on, we're going to give you your test access to the Docker daemon to do whatever it wants. And they said, we're not really sure about that.
Right. You're right. And you have to be root and then machine running that. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to spin out more containers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
if you want to root your whole thing. But
so
anyway,
so the pros and cons are, it's tricky and annoying to do Docker compose. Not tricky, really. I say setup can be tricky. You've done it a couple of times. It's not too bad. The main problem is that the DB containers are needlessly spun up throughout the entire test cycle, and that's resource inefficient. Whereas with test containers, it's quick and easy, and you can spin up a separate container for each test, which gives you true test separation, and it's resource efficient, and it's smart management of cleanup. But there's a security issue. So there's the trade-offs. Yeah. I don't know whether DevOps were definitely right. Do you think that in fact they were absolutely right? I don't know. I feel like what I was doing was kind of safe, but they weren't letting me.
It depends the underlying execution.
Yeah.
When you have a say oh crap, a Jenkins process, it could spin up slaves on demand that way, and you can further socket. So you will have the master that would spin as many slaves as it needs, and you can parallel the work a lot using that trick. Now, if you do that, maybe something you want to consider is Docker within Docker.
I did consider Docker inside Docker, and I think that would have been a little bit of a position of last resort, but it's something I want to try in the future, because you sort of read about it and people go, oh, don't do that. But I don't know, I'd like to try it. Would you say it's always wrong, or sometimes it's got a use?
Well, I'd say, well, for my last year's reading on this area is it's really a bad idea to go production with Docker. But as just a transient setup for the sake of testing our integration tests, why not?
Yeah, I think it might have some use case. It's going to be something I try. I'm very interested in just trying out little kind of Docker things. At the moment, I'm doing a lot of coding inside Docker containers, which helps to keep the local development setup exactly the same as production. I really enjoy that. So it's definitely an area I'm sort of mucking around with a lot, and I find it very useful.
Thank you very much for that.